Albuquerque, New Mexico, a city of breathtaking sunsets, sprawling deserts, and a dark, unsolved mystery that continues to haunt its people. The West Mesa murders remain one of the most chilling and enigmatic serial killings in modern American history. A story of terror buried beneath the sands, victims forgotten for years, and a silent predator who lurked undetected. But how did this macabre tale come to light? What horrifying secrets lay beneath the dry, unforgiving earth? It was February 2, 2009, a day that started like any other in the quiet suburban sprawl on the western edge of Albuquerque. A woman named Christine Ross had taken her dog for a walk near a developing area known as the West Mesa. The land was barren and dry, with construction projects halted due to the economic downturn. The area, though desolate, wasn't considered dangerous until that morning. As her dog sniffed around, Christine noticed something strange protruding from the dirt. Curiosity got the better of her, and when she bent down to examine it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a human bone. Her first instinct was disbelief. Maybe it was from an animal? Maybe it had been there for years, a relic of the past? But the gnawing feeling in her gut told her otherwise. She quickly took a picture of the bone and sent it to her sister, who worked as a nurse. The response came immediately: "Call the police. Now." The authorities arrived within minutes, and soon, a chilling excavation began. As forensic teams started digging, what they uncovered would shake the city to its core. This was no isolated find. One by one, the remains of multiple women were unearthed. Skeletal remains, some complete, some scattered, revealing a mass grave stretching across the parched land. The deeper they dug, the darker the truth became. This was not a random burial site. This was the work of a methodical, calculating killer. And the West Mesa had just revealed a secret long buried in silence. 4 months, forensic anthropologists worked tirelessly, piecing together remains, matching DNA samples, and compiling a list of the dead. In total, 11 women and 1 unborn child were discovered in the mass grave. Each one had vanished between 2001 and 2005, their disappearances barely making headlines at the time. Now, in death, they could no longer be ignored. The victims were primarily women, many with troubled pasts, some involved in sex work, others battling addiction. But they were more than just statistics or names on a cold case file. They were mothers, daughters, and sisters whose stories had been lost in the shadows. One of the victims was Victoria Chavez, a young woman with a radiant smile and a difficult past. She had struggled with addiction but was working to rebuild her life. Another was Gina Michelle Valdez, who had disappeared in her early 20s, pregnant at the time. And there were more. 11 lives cut short, 11 families left with unanswered questions, and a city now gripped with fear. The realization that a serial killer had been operating undetected for years sent shockwaves through Albuquerque. How had this happened? How had so many women vanished without a trace, only to be found buried together years later? Detectives began retracing their steps. They combed through missing person reports, scrutinized last known locations, and interviewed families desperate for answers. The connections were clear. Many of the victims had known each other, had frequented the same areas, and had lived on the fringes of society where their disappearances had largely gone unnoticed. But one question loomed above all others. Who had done this? Rumors swirled. Was this the work of a single predator or multiple killers? Was it someone familiar with the area, someone who had intimate knowledge of how to dispose of bodies so effectively? The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized they were dealing with a ghost, a killer who had operated in silence, evaded detection, and vanished without a trace. Little did they know, the search for the perpetrator would lead them down a dark and twisted path, one filled with dead ends, chilling suspects, and a revelation no one saw coming. Upside down. The discovery of the West Mesa mass grave had sent tremors of fear and confusion through Albuquerque. What started as a single bone found by Christine Ross had turned into a nightmarish revelation. But as the days passed, so did the growing sense of dread. The question that had been swirling from the moment the bodies were unearthed loomed larger and larger. Who had committed such an atrocity? The authorities were quick to act. The local police, alongside FBI investigators, were tasked with unraveling this web of horror. They faced the daunting challenge of identifying the victims, many of whom had vanished years before the mass grave was discovered. These were women who had lived on the fringes of society, vulnerable, often ignored. Their disappearances hadn't made headlines, their families hadn't raised alarms in time to catch the attention of the wider public. But now, in death, they had a voice, a grim chorus of silent screams rising from beneath the dirt. Investigators worked tirelessly, matching DNA samples and piecing together the identities of the victims. It was slow, painstaking work. Some families, having long since given up hope, were stunned to hear from the police. The brutal reality was that many of these women had been missing for years, and in their absence, life had gone on. Families had moved on. But now, with the victims' remains brought to the surface, the past had caught up with the present. One by one, the women were identified. There was Victoria Chavez, a woman with a difficult past who had been trying to turn her life around before she vanished in 2004. Then there was Gina Michelle Valdez, a young woman who had been pregnant when she disappeared. Her unborn child, too, was found among the skeletal remains. The names of the other women were like echoes of a forgotten world. Women who had been invisible in life, but whose deaths had now thrust them into the spotlight of a harrowing investigation. But even as the names were revealed, the search for the killers seemed to go nowhere. In the early days of the investigation, suspicion fell on a range of possible suspects. One of the first theories was that the killer might have been someone who had a personal connection to the victims. Maybe it was a serial abuser, someone who had crossed paths with these women in their troubled lives. But as the investigators looked deeper, they realized the pattern wasn't as clear as they had hoped. One key element that kept surfacing was the location of the bodies, buried in the West Mesa, a remote area with little foot traffic. This suggested that the killer was familiar with the land, someone who knew how to hide their crimes in plain sight, far from prying eyes. The area was sparsely populated, making it the perfect place for a predator to dispose of bodies without drawing attention. A breakthrough came when investigators started looking at suspects who had connections to the area. One name kept cropping up: Terry Rees, a man who had lived near the West Mesa for years. He was a loner, a man with a history of violent behavior and a tendency to isolate himself from the world around him. But despite being questioned multiple times, he had never been formally linked to the crimes. At first glance, Terry seemed like an obvious suspect. His background, his demeanor, everything pointed to him. But there was a problem. No physical evidence could be linked directly to him. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing to place him at the scene of the crime. His house was searched, but the authorities found nothing to support the growing suspicion that he was the killer. As months went by, the investigation seemed to stall. The case grew cold, and the trail seemed to vanish just as quickly as it had appeared. Detectives turned to forensic evidence, hoping that new technology would yield fresh leads, but even that proved difficult. The killer had been careful, too careful, and had left very little behind. Still, there was one element that couldn't be ignored: a creeping sense that the killer might be closer than anyone realized. The West Mesa, so isolated and desolate, was an odd location for such a crime. But if the killer lived nearby, they would have known just how to avoid detection. Perhaps they were a local, someone who had watched the women in the area, waited for the perfect opportunity, and then struck when no one was looking. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The investigation, once filled with promise, now seemed to be nothing more than a cold case. It wasn't until a new lead emerged, something that no one had anticipated, that the case would take a dramatic turn. A woman named Stephanie Brown came forward. She had been a childhood friend of one of the victims, Gina Valdez. She had always suspected something wasn't right about Gina's disappearance, but had never felt she could do anything about it. But recently, a disturbing memory had resurfaced, something that had slipped from her mind over the years. She remembered a man she had once seen with Gina around the time of her disappearance. He had been with her just days before she vanished. And he wasn't just any man, he was a familiar face in the community. Michael Ortiz, a man who had lived in Albuquerque for years and one with a history of criminal behavior. The memory was unsettling, and as Stephanie shared her story with the police, investigators quickly realized that Michael Ortiz had been linked to other incidents in the area. He had been questioned several times during the early stages of the investigation, but the police had never had enough evidence to pursue him further. This time, however, things were different. The new lead was the missing link they needed to reignite the case. Detectives immediately began looking into Michael Ortiz's past. They discovered that he had a long history of violent behavior, with several run-ins with the law. He had been arrested for assault, but never convicted. There were rumors that he had been involved in drugs, and that he frequented the same places the victims had. But despite all this, Ortiz had never been considered a serious suspect. As the investigation gained momentum, the authorities began to piece together a chilling portrait of the man who had once been overlooked. The more they learned about Ortiz, the more they realized they had found their prime suspect. And yet, the question remained, could Michael Ortiz really be the killer? Or was there more to the story than met the eye? As the investigation continued, it became clear that the West Mesa murders were not just the work of a lone killer, they were part of a deeper, darker mystery, one that would reveal shocking truths about the people who lived in the shadow of Albuquerque's deserts. The truth, it seemed, was far more complex and far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. As the police worked tirelessly to build a case, another name began to surface, one that had been lurking in the shadows of the investigation for years but had never been fully explored. Lorenzo Montoya. Montoya was a well-known figure in Albuquerque's underground world. A man with a violent history, he had long been suspected of preying on vulnerable women, particularly those involved in sex work. He had been arrested multiple times, often for violent encounters with women who had barely escaped with their lives. But he had always managed to avoid a long prison sentence. He was a predator who thrived in the darkness, hiding in plain sight. Detectives began to re-examine his past, and what they found was chilling. Montoya had lived just 3 miles away from the West Mesa burial site. That alone wasn't enough to convict him, but the more they dug into his activities, the more disturbing connections they uncovered. In 2006, just 1 year after the last known victim of the West Mesa murders had vanished, Montoya had been killed in what many believed was an act of self-defense. He had brought a sex worker, Shireen Long, to his trailer home on the outskirts of Albuquerque. But what happened next was something straight out of a horror film. Montoya had bound Shireen with duct tape, and when she realized what was happening, she fought for her life. But Montoya wasn't expecting resistance. In the midst of the struggle, Shireen's boyfriend had arrived outside. Realizing something was wrong, he burst into the trailer and shot Montoya dead. The police had written it off as a case of self-defense. And at the time, it was viewed as nothing more than a violent man meeting a violent end. But now, years later, the investigators looking into the West Mesa case couldn't ignore the chilling implications. Montoya's home had been filled with disturbing evidence, ropes, restraints, and a collection of videotapes that hinted at his violent tendencies. Many of the women he had interacted with had vanished without a trace. Could he have been responsible for the West Mesa murders? The timeline fit. The disappearances had stopped after Montoya's death. If he had been the killer, that would explain why the murders had abruptly ceased in 2005. He hadn't gone dormant. He had died before he could claim another victim. But there was still doubt. Some investigators weren't convinced that Montoya had acted alone. The burial site at the West Mesa was not the work of an impulsive killer. It had been planned, methodical. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure these women were never found. Was it possible that Montoya had been working with someone else? Some theorized that Montoya had been part of a larger network, a ring of predators who had exploited vulnerable women, taking advantage of their struggles to keep their crimes hidden. There were whispers of police corruption, of missing persons cases that had been ignored, of traffickers who had used Albuquerque as a hunting ground for years. To this day, the true scope of the West Mesa murders remains unknown. While many investigators believe Montoya was the prime suspect, he was never officially charged, and with his death, many of the answers died with him. Some believe that his death was too convenient, that someone else out there, perhaps even someone with influence, had been involved but had covered their tracks well. The case, despite years of investigation, remains unsolved. The West Mesa is still haunted by the ghosts of the past, the wind-carrying whispers of the women who were lost, their stories never fully told. Families of the victims continue to seek justice, demanding answers that may never come. But one thing is certain: the killer, or killers, walked among them for years. And perhaps, somewhere out there, they still do.